Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this new workshop. Tonight we will talk about oligopoly. This is the third market structure that we need to investigate, that we need to study in A2. We've already talked about perfect competition. We've already talked about monopoly, which are two market structures that are useful, especially as benchmarks. However, those two market structures are not quite realistic. Okay, they are mostly theoretical, especially perfect competition. So there are some markets that are more or less close to perfect competition, and the typical examples that we use are the markets for some agricultural commodities. Some of them are actually quite competitive. The output that is sold is relatively similar. So there is a low degree of differentiation. There are many small businesses, pretty low barriers to entry as well. So it's true that these markets are good examples of relatively competitive markets. For monopoly, there are some examples of markets that are pretty close to what we call a pure monopoly, but it's really hard to find examples of markets that are like pretty much 100% monopoly, because the assumptions are quite strict when you think about it. Finding markets when there is only one seller facing many buyers, it is actually possible. This could be because of a public monopoly where the only seller is the government, so it does exist. But it's not the only assumption to describe a monopoly. You know that the barriers to entry also have to be extremely high. And actually, it is possible to find example of this as well. Because again, if in the case of a public monopoly, by law, nobody else can enter this market. But the last assumption is really the one that makes it very hard to find examples of monopoly in practice. The last assumption tells us that there should be no close substitutes, which indicates that basically consumers, they have no choice. They can either buy the product from the monopolist or they don't buy anything at all. They can't just replace the product that is produced and sold by the monopolist by anything, even if it's slightly different. There are really no close substitute whatsoever. So again, those two market structures are theoretical. They are useful as a benchmark, but they are not quite realistic. What we have to do now is to look at market structures that are, let's say, in between those two extreme benchmarks, that are in between those two extreme cases, and market structures that we can actually encounter in practice that actually exist. There are two last market structures that we need to discuss. We need to talk about oligopolies, which is essentially a market structure in which there are just a few big businesses. This is what we are going to do tonight. And the last market structure that we must investigate is the case of a monopolistic competition, where you have many small businesses. There are no barriers to entry. So what distinguishes it from perfect competition is that instead of having many small businesses, all of them selling the exact same product, in monopolistic competition, we'll see that each small businesses sells something that is slightly different, of course similar, otherwise this would not be the same market, but there is some product differentiation which will give some market power to each individual firm. Okay, but today the emphasis is on oligopoly. You can already access most of the files on the website. I'm still working on the list of definitions and on the summary. This is something that will be added shortly. So just if you do not see the link download all at the bottom of the list of files, this means that I'm still working on some documents, and that shortly you will have everything ready, everything available. You probably know that recently I've been quite busy organizing various events, and in particular an essay writing workshop. So now I finally have more time for me, more time to focus on the improvement of these documents. So in a few days, in a few weeks, you will see that more files will be made available if you have registered to this workshop and other previous workshops as well. Okay, let's get started. Let's talk about oligopolies. All right. And the first thing that we must do is to talk about game theory. So why do we have to talk about game theory, and why now? Why not earlier? Why don't we talk about game theory when we talk about perfect competition? Why don't we talk about game theory when we talk about a monopoly? Well, simply because a game theory is a method that we use to analyze or to study strategic interaction between players. So strategic interaction, it's a bit fancy, but it means something quite simple. It simply means that basically your benefit or your payoff, your reward, of course, it depends on your decisions. Yes, but it also depends on the decisions of other people. And that's why we call that game theory, because this is something that is quite typical when you play board games, right? If you play chess, the outcome of the game, who will win the game, depends on your strategy, and it also depends on the strategy of the other player. So that is why game theory is something that we only study now, because in perfect competition, remember that there were many, many small businesses, and because of that, there are just too many players. And because of that, it's not possible for each of them to take into account the strategies of all the other players. And remember that in perfect competition, it doesn't matter if you are one small business, it doesn't matter how much you produce, you have no influence on the market price. Okay, that's what we said, that businesses were price takers in perfect competition. So again, when you think about it, if each firm in perfect competition, it doesn't matter what they do, the market price will be unaffected. This means that there is no strategic interaction in perfect competition. So that's why we did not need to talk about game theory. In Monopoly, it's obvious we didn't talk about game theory, because there was one single seller, there was one single firm, and therefore, again, there was no strategic interaction between the monopolist and anybody else. Okay, one single seller. However, we'll see when we study the oligopoly, there are several businesses, but it's just usually a few businesses, sufficiently few businesses for them to take into account the strategy of their competitors, and to take into account the strategy of their competitors to design, to choose what their own strategy should be. So that's why we need to study game theory. Okay, so I think it's also always important that you start explaining to your students why we need game theory now, what is the purpose of it. Okay, and because we will study games, it is important to know what are the characteristics of a game. And when we define a game, when we describe a situation in which there is strategic interaction, there are essentially three things that we have to define. We have to tell who is involved in the game, so what are the players, what they can do in the game, so what are the possible strategies that they can implement in the game, and finally, for each possible combination of strategies of all players, we will have the payoffs, which is basically the rewards. Okay, how much each player is going to get at the end of the day for a given combination or set of strategies. And for A2, your students, they do not need to have a very extensive knowledge of game theory. To be honest, I remember my first year teaching this curriculum. I had a very, very detailed PPT on game theory, because this was one of my favorite, this is one of my favorite subjects. This is something that I used to teach at the university. So I was very happy. Yeah, finally I can teach game theory in high school. I was very excited. But then my students were a bit overwhelmed, and most of the content that I taught was not very useful for the exam. So the PPT that I'm going to use tonight is very simple, and it really focuses on the key ideas, because in practice, A2 students, they just need to have a very basic idea of what is game theory, how it can be used. And in particular, we will only look at two-player games, okay? otherwise it's going to be too complicated, to play finite games. Finite means that there is a finite number of strategies. And usually, again, we will look at games in which there are only two possible strategies, such as high price, low price, okay, to simplify. And what we use to represent those games is something that we call a payoff matrix. And the best way to explain to your students or to illustrate what is a payoff matrix with a game that everybody knows is to do rock, paper, scissors, okay? So you can actually build this type of payoff matrix, and just to emphasize that, yeah, look, in this case, we do have two players. So we have defined the set of players, player one and player two. Each player, for each player, we have defined what are the possible strategies, okay? So each player can play a rock, paper, scissors, RPS. So you see that each row of the table represents a strategy for player one, and each column of the table represents a strategy for player two. And therefore, 3 strategies for each. We have 9 possible combinations of strategies. So each 9 cells, okay? And within each cell, so what we have is just the first number is the reward, or the payment, or the payoff that goes to player one. And the second number is the reward that goes to player two. You might also see it in a different way. Sometimes, let me just show you so there is no surprise. Sometimes each cell is actually cut in diagonally, like this. Yeah, we can try to do it. Okay, like this. Okay, something like that. You've probably seen that before, right? Sometimes each cell is cut this way, and then what we have in the bottom left, we have a number that is written in the bottom left triangle, which is the reward of player one. And the top right triangle, you have a number, a figure, which represents the payoff for player two, okay? So you sometimes have something like that. It's the same, but I don't really like this representation. So I usually just write, I open brackets, I write 2 figures. The first one goes for player one, the second one goes for player two, okay? But make sure that your students are familiar with the 2 possible representations, okay? All right. Okay, what do we see? We see that, of course, on the diagonal, this is a rock, rock, paper, paper, scissors, scissors. So it's a draw. Nobody wins, nobody loses. Okay, so 0-0. For example, if I look at the first column, I have here player one plays paper, player two plays rock. Okay, so player one will win, get, for example, $10, and player two loses, and therefore we'll have to pay $10 to player one. Okay, assuming that they bet $10. And actually, this type of game, we call that a zero-sum game, because you see that regardless of the outcome, if you add the payments of player one and player two, you see that overall the sum of the payment is 0, because it is simply a transfer from one player to the other. What one player wins, the other player loses it. And I remember, I think this was 1 or 2 years ago, 2 years ago, I think there was a data response where students were asked about the definition of a zero-sum game. Okay, so you have here a good example of a zero-sum game. What one player wins, the other player loses. So overall, when we add the overall payment, we find 0. If you look at the last cell of the first column, player one plays scissors, player two plays rock, so player one loses, player two wins, so player one has to pay 10 to player two, so minus 10. All right, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm really confident that you know how this works. But yeah, please do not start with the prisoner's dilemma. If you start with games that they can understand, and then gradually you can introduce the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, but I really recommend that you start with something that everybody knows, so they know how to build a table, they understand how it works, and then you can introduce the concept of the prisoner's dilemma. The second example that I use is a very famous game that we call the Battle of the Sexes. So the story is quite simple. We have two players. It's a couple, okay, a married couple, let's say. There is a man and there is a husband and wife, okay, husband and wife. And it's a very cliche actually. They have to choose whether they have one evening off and they have to decide, all right, what are we going to do tonight? Should we go to the opera? So O stands for opera, or should we go watch the football game? And of course, what's important for them is to be together. Okay, they do not want to be apart. So even though the man prefers football over the opera and the woman prefers opera over football, okay, I told you this was very cliche. What is really important for them is to be together. So if you look at the anti-diagonal, I think we call it this way, the anti-diagonal, okay, so those two cells, these would represent situations when they are not together. Okay, for example, the woman goes to watch the football game and her husband goes to the opera, and here the woman goes to the opera and the man goes to watch the football game. And you see that, all right, they are so unhappy because they are not together that they both get a payment of or satisfaction, a utility, if you want, a utility of 0. On the diagonal, however, we have the two outcomes, the two combination of strategies where they choose to go to the same event. So for example, this one would show a case where they both go to the opera, okay? And in this case, they both go to the football game. So because they are together, they are very happy, but one is a little bit happier than the other because of course they have their personal preferences. So if they both go to the opera, the wife is going to be a bit happier because she likes opera better. And if they both go to the football game, then the husband is a bit happier because going to the football game is his first best. Okay, so this is a very famous game in game theory. We will see that there are two Nash equilibria in pure strategy. So this is what we call a coordination game, okay, because there are two possible outcomes, but we'll see that later. All right, so yeah, I usually start by introducing those two very famous games, and then you can start talking about the prisoner's dilemma. So before you explain the game, you should try to provide them with a definition, simply because sometimes there are some essay questions where the prisoner's dilemma is explicitly mentioned, and therefore students should first start by defining it. So this is the best way I came up with to define it. So it's a game, of course. It's a situation in which there is strategic interaction between players. And there are two key characteristics in the prisoner's dilemma. First characteristic is that each player has an incentive to choose a strategy that is good for itself, but that is going to be bad for the other. Okay, so what's good for me is going to be bad for the other player. And of course, therefore, each player has an incentive to, let's say, take a selfish decision, okay? And implement or choose a strategy that's going to be selfish, that's going to be benefit itself at the expense of the other player. But when both players do that, or when all players do that, when they both choose the selfish strategies, or they both make a selfish decision, then at the end of the day, we end up with an outcome that is very bad collectively. Okay, we end up with an outcome that is much worse than if the two players had cooperated. Okay, if we had found a way to make them work together, to agree and commit to choose a strategy that is going to benefit both of us. Okay, so that's really, in general, when we talk about the prisoner's dilemma, that's the idea. So to simplify it to use very simple words, because this definition might be a bit complicated. So to simplify it to your students, just say that it's a situation where you do something selfish and you think it's going to be good for you, but because everybody does the same, everybody does something selfish, then at the end of the day, we reach a situation that is bad for everyone. Okay. And once you have introduced that, you can introduce the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so you guys know the story, right? So you have two gangsters, they have robbed a bank, or of course there are different possible stories you can tell, but that's the story I tell. two gangsters. They rob the bank and they get caught by the police. They are brought to separate interrogation rooms, and then the police they play a good cop bad cop with them, and they try to extract a confession, because of course if they confess, then they can go to jail longer. So the police has already collected enough evidence to send them in jail for some time, for 3 years actually. That's why you have -3. L stands for lie and C stands for confess. Okay, so lie means they say something like no, I'm not responsible for this robbery. I did not rob the bank. And C stands for confess. They say, yeah, I did it. Sorry, my bad. So even if they both lie, that's the idea. Even if they both lie, then the police has enough evidence to send them to jail for 3 years, and that's why they lose 3 years of their lives basically in jail. So that's why we have -3. However, the police can offer them a deal. Okay, say something like, hey, your partner is in the other cell, just in the other room, and if you tell the truth before your partner in crime tells the truth, but before your partner confesses, then you get a deal and you only go to jail for 1 year. Okay, but you got to be quick, because it's basically first come, first serve, right? The first who's going to denounce his or her partner is going to get the deal, and the other will get nothing. And because the other has been too slow, well, it's going to go to jail for a very long time. That's basically the idea. So if one player, let's say player one, if player one confesses before player two, so player two just has refused to tell the truth in time, then player one gets the deal and only goes to jail for 1 year. Okay, that's a good deal. And player two, who has failed to tell the truth in time, will be punished because the police has enough evidence to prove that he's responsible for the robbery, and he will also be punished because he has not cooperated with the police. Okay, so he really goes to jail for a very long time. And of course, the opposite happens if it is player two who confesses before player one. And if both players, if they both confess, well, then they go to jail a very long time, because again, basically nobody gets the deal if the deal also works if only one of them confesses. If both of them they tell the truth, nobody gets the deal, and they both go to jail for a long time. However, not as long as 12 years, because they have cooperated with the police. So the police can just give them some kind of a discount, say, okay, you've cooperated, you've told the truth, so you don't go to jail for 12 years, but only 10 years. Okay, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of this game because I find it a bit complicated to explain. I actually find the prisoner's dilemma much easier to explain with high price, low price, really, for in an oligopoly. Yeah. However, we call it the prisoner's dilemma, so I feel like it's important that you tell the original story. But you see, it's a bit long to explain. I find it a bit long to explain. There is a lot of context to give. That's why I think it's just easier to use an example, high price, low price, because we clearly understand that both firms have an interest in both charging a high price, that charging a low price is going to be bad for the both of them. But of course, every firm has an incentive to undercut their competitor by charging a low price. But if everybody does that, everybody charges a low price and everybody loses. So it's much easier to explain than the prisoner's dilemma. However, your students should know the original story. Okay, you see, for now, I have not even solved the games. I've just described them, okay, because we have not yet talked about how we actually solve the game. And there are two criteria that we can use to solve those games. The first equilibrium criterion is what we call the Nash equilibrium. And actually, it's the easiest, and it's sufficient for A2. So if you want to focus on the Nash equilibrium, it's okay. Today I will present two criteria. We'll talk about Nash equilibrium, and I will talk about what we call the dominant strategy equilibrium. They are not the same criteria. We use different criteria. Okay, so if we want to understand the concept of Nash equilibrium, first what we have to do is to define the concept of best response. Okay, Nash equilibrium is based on best response. A best response is simply the best strategy that you should choose given the strategies of the other player. Okay, so if you anticipate that the other player will confess, for example, if we use the prisoner's dilemma, okay, what is your best response? What should you do? Would you get a higher payoff if you confess, or would you get a higher payoff if you lie? All right, that's what we call the best response. And the Nash equilibrium is a combination of strategies, so a combination of strategies, we call that a strategy profile, such that each player is best responding to the other player's strategy. So to put it simply, it's a combination of strategy where everybody plays a best response, okay? And because everybody plays a best response, you don't have an incentive to change your strategy, okay? Changing your strategy could only make you worse off. And because everybody plays the best response, it means nobody has an incentive to change, okay? That's what I write here. And nobody can be better off by changing strategy. And that's why we call that an equilibrium, okay? An equilibrium is something that is stable. This is stable because everybody plays the best response, so nobody wants to move away from that equilibrium, okay? So you can illustrate it with rock, paper, scissors. So what you can do, and that's something that I like to do with my students and they really enjoy, so just show that on your on the board, and then just invite some students to go to the board and to circle the best responses. Usually they really like to do that, so feel free to do so. Okay, let's just do it together. So you say, okay, I am player one, and I think player two is going to play rock. What is my best response? I can play rock and get 0, paper and get 10, or scissors and get -10. Okay, so clearly in this case, if I want to maximize my payoff, I should choose paper and I would get 10. Okay, if I am player one and I believe player two will play paper, what is my best response? I can play rock and get -10, paper and get 0, or scissors and get 10. Okay, so clearly my best response is here playing scissors and getting 10. And same thing, if I think player two will play rock, my best response is to play scissors. Okay, so what we have done here is to identify the best responses for player one. Now we're going to take the perspective of player two and we're going to do the same thing. If I am player two and I believe player one is going to play rock, I can play rock and get 0, so careful. Now we look at the second number because we are player two. I can play paper and get 10, or scissors and get -10. So clearly my best response is to play paper and get 10. I am player two. I believe player one is going to play paper. I can play rock and get -10, paper and get 0, or scissors and play 10. Okay, so I circle my best response, and same thing, of course, if I believe player one is going to play scissors. And here, what we see is that there is no Nash equilibrium. How do I know? Because I have not, there is no cell in which I have circled the two numbers, which means that I can take any possible combination of strategies. Let's have a closer look at just one for me to illustrate why we do not have a Nash equilibrium in this game. Let's focus on this one, for example. Let's look at this one. And here I'm going to explain to you why this cannot be a Nash equilibrium. So actually player one is playing the best response. You see, I have circled 10 here, which means that, yeah, okay, player one, if player two plays scissors, playing rock is the best response. So player one does not have an incentive to change his or her strategy. However, I have not circled -10, which means that player two is not playing the best response. Indeed, if player two thinks that player one is going to play rock, player two should play paper and not scissors, which means that this combination of strategy is not stable because player 2 would want to change its strategy from scissors to paper. Okay, so that's why this is not stable. This is not a Nash equilibrium. Okay, and you could do that for any cell. For any cell, you will see that player, at least one player, will have an incentive to change his or her strategy. In this case, however, and again, you can circle the best responses here. And what you would find, you can do the same thing. So you start taking the perspective, okay, I am the woman, I am the wife, and you do the same thing, okay? So of course, if I think my husband will go to the opera, I should do the same. And if I think my husband will go to the football game, I should do the same. Now we take the perspective of the husband. If I think my wife will go to the opera, I should go to the opera. And if I think my wife will go watch the football game, I should go watch the football game, okay? And you see the difference right away. The difference is that now there are two cells for which I have circled the two numbers, which means that both players are playing a best response, okay? So there are two strategy profile, OO, so they both go to the opera and they both go to the football game, that are stable because both play a best response and they have no incentive to move away from this equilibrium. So this is a game in which we have two Nash equilibrium. Finally, if we look at the prisoner's dilemma, which is our third example, then we can do exactly the same thing. So I'm not going to explain everything again. I think you get the idea now. So I'm just going to circle the best response quickly, and we would see that the best response. So this would be the best response for player 1, and this would be the best responses for player 2. Okay, well, you can just do it again if you are not convinced, but this is what you would find. And clearly here we would see that there is one single Nash equilibrium, and this single Nash equilibrium is actually the worst possible outcome, right? Because this is the outcome where they both confess and they both go to jail for 10 years. So overall 20 years of jail for the two of them in total, which is the worst possible outcome. And this is why. And this is exactly what the prisoner's dilemma illustrates. Everyone feels like they have an incentive to confess because they feel like, oh, if I confess, it's a selfish action and I will get the deal with the police and I will only go to jail for 1 year. So they are all encouraged to choose the selfish strategy. But of course, if they both do that, this leads to an outcome that is bad collectively. Okay, so this is a non-cooperative outcome, which is very inefficient collectively. Clearly, if there was a way for them to agree, to communicate, and to commit to lie, okay, this is what we would call the cooperative outcome. This would be much better collectively because in total, they would only have 6 years in jail. This would be the best possible outcome collectively. So this is what we would call the cooperative outcome. But again, because if they cannot commit to lie, there is no system to guarantee that this is the strategy that they will actually choose. Each of them has an incentive to deviate from this cooperative equilibrium, to deviate and to confess rather than lie in the hopes of going to jail for a shorter period of time. But because they both do that, this leads to the worst possible situation for them. All right. Again, I think you are already familiar with this concept, so I think I can move a bit quickly on that. Okay. Then there is an exercise for your students to identify a Nash equilibrium. So I'm not going to do it with you because the system is exactly the same. So ask your students to circle the best responses, and there will be one single cell in which they have circled the two numbers, which indicates that there is a single Nash equilibrium in the game. Please be careful because sometimes students, they say there is a single Nash equilibrium 11-15. No, a Nash equilibrium is a combination of strategies. Okay, it's not what the numbers we have there. They are not strategies. They are the payments, the rewards associated with a given combination of strategies. Okay, the Nash equilibrium is C for player one, F for player two. Okay, that's how you define a Nash equilibrium. All right, so this is the first way you can solve a game. You can identify the best responses and find a combination of strategies in which every player is playing the best response. There is another criterion which is actually stronger, which is actually more demanding. But for A2, in fact, I'm pretty sure all games that your students they may encounter can also be solved using the concept of strategic dominance. Okay, so if you want to skip this, if you want to just focus on Nash equilibrium with your students, this should be enough. Okay, this should be enough. They should not have any problem answering any question, MCQ or essay question, if they are only familiar with the concept of Nash equilibrium. But that being said, I usually also introduce the concept of strategic dominance. So it's up to you if you feel like it's relevant, and if you have time, you may also introduce that concept. It's a bit different. So what we say for strategic dominance, we look at two strategies, A and B, for example, and we'll say that strategy A dominates strategy B. Basically, if it's always better, if it always provides more money, a higher payoff, and by always, I mean regardless of what the other players do. Okay, it doesn't matter what strategy is chosen by the other players. I can always have a larger payoff by choosing A over B. And when this is the case, of course, you will never play B. Okay, B is just a weak strategy. You should never play strategy B. So you can eliminate it, basically. A rational player will never play a dominated strategy. Yes. And sometimes in some games, you have something even stronger than that. You have one strategy that dominates all of the other. Okay, so if you have three strategies, you have A, B, C, for example, you would have strategy A that dominates strategy B and strategy A that dominates strategy C. Then we say that strategy A is a dominant strategy. It is always better than all of the other strategies. What does it mean? It means that in that case, a player will always play a dominant strategy. Okay. And if each player, so you see, it's very, very strict, it's very demanding. If each player has a dominant strategy, so let's put it differently, if for each player of the game, there is one strategy that is always better than all of the other possible strategy, so you see that's a pretty tough conditions, then we say that the game has a dominant strategy equilibrium. All right, so okay, it's actually stronger than the concept of Nash equilibrium. Okay, so if you have a dominant strategy equilibrium, it is also a Nash equilibrium, but the opposite is not true, simply because the concept of Nash equilibrium is weaker than the concept of dominant strategy equilibrium. Okay, so for rock, paper, scissors, there is no dominant strategy. Of course, there is not one strategy that is better than the other. Okay, you cannot say that rock is always better than paper, or scissors is always better than rock. No, because it depends. It depends on what the other player is going to do. So clearly, in this case, there is no dominated strategy in that game. All right, let's have a look at this one. And that's the same thing. You cannot say that opera is always better than football, or football is always better than opera, because again, it depends. It depends if you are the wife, for example, whether opera is better than football depends on where your husband will go. Okay, so because it depends, it is not a dominant strategy, because a dominant strategy is always better. So it doesn't depend on what the other player is going to do. So here, same thing, no dominant or dominated strategies in that game. However, and this is where it gets interesting when we look at the prisoner's dilemma, in this game, there is a dominant strategy. There is a dominant strategy for each player. How do I know? I can just look at one strategy for player one. So let's say that I look at the strategy confess, and I see that if player two chooses to lie, then confess is better than lie, okay? Because if I confess, I only go to jail for 1 year. If I lie, I go to jail for 3 years, okay? And if player 2 chooses to confess, then again, confessing for me, player 1, is better than lying, because I only go to jail 10 years, which is better than 12 years. So you see that for player 1, confessing is always better than lying. It doesn't matter what player 2 may do, lie or confess, you are always better off confessing rather than lying. So we say that lying is dominated by confessing. Confessing, because there are only 2 strategies, is a dominant strategy. And of course, the same goes with player 2, because the game is symmetric. Okay, what is true for player 1 is also true for player 2. So in that game, confessing is a dominant strategy for both players, and therefore this combination of strategies, confessing, is a dominant strategy equilibrium. So it is a Nash equilibrium, and it is also a dominant strategy equilibrium. All right. So you may want to introduce this concept to your students. However, if you want to focus on the concept of Nash equilibrium, it is fine. Okay, it's going to be sufficient. And again, there is one game here where students are expected to identify the dominant strategy equilibrium. And yes, there is one. So what they have to do is simply to compare strategies 2 by 2, and they will eventually be able to find that, yes, this combination of strategy is a dominant strategy equilibrium. Why? Because B is always better than A for player 1, and B is always better than C for player 1. Okay, so B is a dominant strategy. So player 1 is always going to play strategy B. And for player 2, strategy F is always better than E, and F is always better than D. Okay, so same thing, F is a dominant strategy for player 2. Therefore, player 2 will always play strategy F. And at the end of the day, we can conclude that BF is a dominant strategy equilibrium. Okay, cool. All right, questions? Are we good? Yes, so that's the introduction about game theory. Does it make sense? Do you have any questions about that? Please let me know. Or if it's okay, just type that we can move on. Make sense? Again, if you want to focus on just Nash equilibrium, it's fine. And usually what I do, by the way, I often, when I talk about Nash equilibrium, I often show them a scene from the movie A Beautiful Mind. Of course, I don't watch the entire movie with them because I don't think it's fully relevant. But I show them the scene where John Nash, which is I think played by Russell Crowe, right? Well, finds the ideal, and he's in a bar, and there is like 3 or 4 girls that enter into the bar, and there is one blonde lady, and he just realizes that the decisions of his friends, so that there is some kind of conflict. There can be some conflict of interest between the actions of his friends, and that's, well, I highly doubt that this is what really happened in practice, but at least there is that scene where he understands this, basically the prisoner's dilemma, and he understands that what some individuals do if they pursue their self-interest, and if they implement a selfish action, this might lead to the worst possible decision, which is interesting because it is exactly the opposite of what is predicted by Adam Smith with the invisible hand, right? The invisible hand, the key idea is that when everybody makes decision to make self-interested decision, when everybody makes self-interested decision, Adam Smith says that at the end of the day, this is going to generate the largest possible welfare or benefit for society overall. Okay, so basically do something selfish, it's good for the people around you. That's basically the invisible hand. The concept of the prisoner's dilemma is the exact opposite. And we see that do something selfish, this leads to the worst possible outcome collectively. So it's interesting because it is it's the complete opposite of what was predicted by or explained by Adam Smith. Is there an example to show Nash equilibrium is not a dominant strategy equilibrium? I don't know. How about well, probably this one. Probably this one. So this one, this is a Nash equilibrium. Okay, that's one. This is Nash equilibrium, but this is not a dominant strategy equilibrium. Okay, why not? Let's do it. Let's just convince ourselves that this is a Nash equilibrium. So let's just circle the best responses. So for player one, I'm gonna have one here, one here, one here, and for player two, here, here, and here. Okay. Okay, so clearly we have indeed a Nash equilibrium. However, this is not a dominant strategy equilibrium. So let's try now to analyze in terms of dominant strategy. So the way you do it, you take strategies 2 by 2. Okay, so 2 by 2. Let's say A and B. So here B is better than A, but A is better than B. Okay, I just compare these two numbers. Okay. So you see that you cannot say that A is better than B or B is better than A. All right. So you don't have one that dominates the other. However, C and B, same thing. You see here, C is worse than B, C is worse than B, and here C is better than B. So same thing. So clearly, C is not a dominant strategy because it is not always better than B. Okay, and actually it is not even better than A. So clearly, C is not a dominant strategy. And I could even do the same thing for player two. So here, 13, so between D and E. So D is better, and here D is worse. Okay, so same thing. Between D and E, you do not have a dominance relationship. You don't have one that is always better than the other. Let's see F and E, for example. So here E is better, and here E is worse. So same thing between E and F, you do not have a dominant strategy. So yeah, in that game, maybe D and F better, worse, no, and C and A better, no. Okay, so in that game, there is no strategy dominates any other strategy for player one and for player two. Okay, so clearly, you do not have a dominant strategy equilibrium here. So can we say if there is a dominant strategy equilibrium, it must be a Nash equilibrium, but even if we have a DSC, it may, maybe if it's not a DSC, it may have a Nash equilibrium. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Basically, to explain it maybe slightly differently or visually, this is how what you can say. Okay, this circle represents all the Nash equilibrium of a game, because there can be several, right? So let's say this is the set of all the Nash equilibrium, okay? Some of them might be, actually, there might be one, okay? There might be one that is going to be the dominant strategy equilibrium, okay? Actually, you can only have one. So you may have one or you may not have one, which means that if you have other Nash equilibria, then they will not be dominant strategy equilibrium. Okay. Or for example, these two Nash equilibria, they are Nash equilibria, but they are not dominant strategy equilibrium. Okay. All right. Any other questions about game theory? I remember when I first taught it, I went much further and I talked about sequential games, repeated games. I even introduced them to the Folk theorem on infinitely repeated games, calculate the minimum discount rate above which cooperation becomes possible. Tit for tat strategies, trigger strategy. So I think I really overwhelmed them. I was just too happy about teaching game theory. And yeah, unfortunately, I think that that year I did not do a very good job for my students. So yeah, we learn from our mistakes. All right. If there are no more questions, let's move on. Let's move on and let's talk about oligopoly. All right, so the first thing we should say about oligopoly, as always, is to talk about the characteristics. Okay, how do we find that? All right, so we have a few price-making firms. Okay, so they have some market power, and therefore they will have some influence over the price. We call them the oligopolists. They hold a large market share, and they face many buyers. Again, it is important to mention how many buyers there are. There are high barriers to entry. Yes, it's another characteristic. Usually because there are important economies of scale, internal economies of scale, and they act as barriers to entry simply because the fact that they are large economies of scale gives a cost advantage to those firms who are already in the market. I already explained that when we talked about monopoly. If you are already in the market and if you already have a large market share, so you produce a large level of output, if there are substantial economies of scale, that means that you can produce at a low per unit cost, compared at least a relatively lower per unit cost than that of a firm a new firm, okay, who has just entered the market and that initially has a small market share. So basically, firms outside the market, when they ask themselves, all right, should I enter this market, yes or no, they anticipate that they would suffer from a severe cost disadvantage because they would have a very small market share, at least at the beginning. And therefore, they might not be able to survive, okay, because they would be less cost efficient than those larger, well-established businesses who exploit economies of scale more fully. Okay, and yes, because they are just a few big firms, they are interdependent, which means that their profit, of course, depends on what they do, depends on their own strategy, but their profit also depends on the strategy of their competitors. Okay, so if you take, I don't know, Apple and Samsung, the profit that is made by Apple depends on its own strategy, but it also depends on the strategy. It could be price, quantity, features, quality, customer service, blah, 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 design, the strategy implemented by Samsung. That's what we mean by strategic interaction. That's what we mean by interdependency. Okay, careful, because sometimes we say that sometimes your students will ask you, all right, so then how many firms? How many firms? Is this 2, 3, 4, 10, 20? It's not a very good indicator because even if you have many firms, the market can still be an oligopoly. And even if you have very few firms, this might not be considered an oligopoly. Let me just show you two cases just to make my point a bit more clear. All right, let's do it. Okay, let's say we have two markets. All right, two markets. In this market, we have only three firms. This one, and this one. Should we, of course, the size indicates market shares. Sorry, forgot to mention. Should we regard this as an oligopoly? What do you think? Should we regard this as an oligopoly? There are three firms, right? So there are just a few firms. Okay, Mitch says no. Oligopoly, not oligopoly. And he's right. This should not be considered an oligopoly. We call that a dominant firm market. It's not exactly a monopoly, okay, because there are more than one seller, but you have one firm that is much bigger than the two other small firms. So this would not be regarded as an oligopoly, because here you would have like it's It's actually closer to a monopoly, and we call that a dominant firm market, where one firm is not exactly a monopoly, but it controls how can I put this? One firm controls 80% or 90% of the total market share. Okay. How about this case? What if we have many small firms, but then 3 much bigger ones? Should we regard this as an oligopoly? And again, I can add as many small firms as you want, okay? So here there is maybe 100 firms. Should we regard something like that as an oligopoly? What do you think? Oligopoly or not? So 3 large firms that control 80% of the market share, and then many smaller firms. Well, I hear your point, Mitch, but what if they are already in the market? You're right that usually it is difficult for small businesses to survive, but what if they are already in the market, so they don't have to break down the barriers to entry? Because I said that it usually comes from economies of scale, yes, but not necessarily. What if they can survive? Okay, let's just assume that these small firms, they can survive in this market, okay? They are already there. They did not have to break down the barriers to entry. They are already there. It's hard for new firms to enter, but those small firms, they are already there. Should we regard this as an oligopoly? Yes, okay, in this case, yes, this fits the definition. There are a few firms that control most of the market share. So even though there are actually many firms, because just a few of them, they control 80-90% of the market shares, you should regard this market as an oligopoly. So you see that the number of firms is actually not very good. That's really the point that I wanted to make with my 2 diagrams, just to show that, yeah, you should not really look at the number of businesses. You should really look at the market share and the concentration ratios. We've talked about the concentration ratio, so you should really look at the, let's say, the 4-firm concentration ratio, the 5-firm concentration ratio, to see, okay, if you take the biggest businesses within a market, what is the total market share that they control, okay? And if you find that overall they control, let's say, 60, 70, 80, 90% of the market share, then this indicates that it is an oligopoly. If you take the 5 largest businesses and you see that they only control 10% or 15% of the market share, then this would not qualify as an oligopoly. Okay. Okay. And because there are a few big firms in an oligopoly, what they do is, yeah, they observe each other. They are interested in the strategy that is implemented by their competitors, and they try to respond, to adapt to these strategies, to find their best response. What is my best response to the strategy of my competitors if I want to maximize my own profit, of course. Remember, we said that in perfect competition, all firms sell the same output, okay? They sell exactly the same product. In a monopoly, we did not even have to talk about that because there was a single firm. In oligopoly, it depends, actually. There are different models. There are some economic models in which we assume that all firms, all oligopolists, they sell the same product. For example, if you look at Bertrand competition or even some corner competition models, we make the assumption that they all sell the same product. And there are other models like the hoteling model or salop model, linear city and circular city, which are oligopolies. that will consider that oligopolies, they are not the same, that they sell differentiated products. Okay, so could be either case, homogeneous output or differentiated output. That being said, if I remember some mark schemes from Cambridge, Cambridge seems to consider that that the industry output is differentiated within an oligopoly, which is not accurate, at least not theoretically. Theoretically, it depends on the model that you consider. Of course, in practice, most oligopolies, yes, most oligopolies are such that the output is differentiated, okay, because it's very hard to find markets in which everyone sells exactly the same thing. So yes, in practice, most oligopolies sell a differentiated output, but in theory, you can have the two models, okay? If we only have two firms, we call that the duopoly, yes, and each firm is known as a duopolist. Okay, just wanted to make this remark. So if your students, they see duopoly, then they know that this is just an oligopoly with two firms. Okay, the rest here is not extremely important. I just wanted to say that, yeah, there are different models. There are different ways you can model an oligopoly, simply because there are different ways firms can compete in this market. They can compete in price, they can compete in quantity, they can compete in quality, they can compete in location, they can compete by choosing their level of advertising. You know, there are so many possible ways they can choose strategies, and for each possible dimension of competition, each possible instrument that you can use to compete with your rivals, there is one model that will analyze how firms actually behave in this type of competition. So yeah, so there are different possible ways you can explain what is going to happen within oligopolies. Okay, and this is actually why it is so hard to study this market structure, because depending on how firms compete, you can have very different outcomes. You can have some outcomes where, even though you have very few firms, they will fight really, really hard. There will be a very aggressive competition between only 2 or 3 firms. We call that cutthroat competition, where each of them is going to sell at the lowest possible price. We call that a price war. They will repeatedly try to undercut their rival by lowering the price. And you can have some models that predict that firms, even if you have quite a few firms, quite many firms competing within oligopolies, some models predict that competition will remain relatively weak, relatively limited, that firms will not fight extremely hard. Okay, so yes, the bottom line is that what is going to happen in an oligopoly, will firms fight really hard? Essentially depends on depends on how they compete. Do they compete in price? Do they compete in quality, in design, in reputation? It really depends on the type of strategic interaction that we are dealing with. Okay, so in particular, yes, of course, within an oligopoly, firms may compete in price, and we often call that Bertrand competition. It is a very, very aggressive form of competition. But if they can differentiate their product, then they can implement what we call, they can use non-price competition. Okay, so of course, non-price competition is only relevant if firms can differentiate their product. Why? Because if they all sell the same product, and if it is impossible for them to achieve product differentiation, then of course the only form of competition that is relevant is price competition. Okay, they sell the same product. The only thing that matters to the consumers is the price, and therefore the only way you can gain market share is by cutting the price. Okay. However, if it is possible to achieve product differentiation, then you may engage in non-price competition. Okay, so that's what I explained here. If they all sell the same product, the only thing that you can do is price competition. okay, because that's all consumers care about. But if you can differentiate your product, then you can try to gain market share and to increase your profit or to charge a higher price by differentiating your product and engaging in non-price competition. Okay, good. These are some examples because there are many possible ways you can compete using something else than the price. There are many other ways you can gain market shares rather by doing something else than charging the lowest possible price. Could be quality, of course. You can differentiate your product by offering a higher quality, and that way you will convince more people to buy your product. Okay, that's quite obvious. Could be the style or the design, so it's not necessarily the quality, just the way it looks. Okay, again, could be cars, could be cell phones, could be shoes, could be purses, could be guitars. Okay, it varies a lot. Could be innovation. Okay, to add new features, to have one product that does something that nobody else can do. Okay, so of course, if you have this is a great competitive advantage. If your product is the only one having one particular feature, that can convince people to buy your product rather than other brands. Could be location. Don't forget location. Location is one way to differentiate your product. Okay, so it could be for bakery. If you are a bakery, you can try to gain market shares by choosing a location that where there is a very dense population. There is a very dense urban population. So therefore, you have a lot of people who will come to your bakery. So it could be that you try to find the best place in town to steal consumers from your competitors. So location matters. Could be, of course, advertising and brand image. Okay, so that's definitely something that businesses do to gain market share. And this is not by lowering the price, okay, brand image, so through advertising. Could be CSR and CER, okay, so again, this relates to brand image, okay, I should have put it together. Brand image, I should have open brackets, CSR, CER. So CSR is, for those students who study business, it should be fine. Corporate social responsibility and corporate environmental responsibility, okay, so just corporate social responsibility could be something like, in our company, we give 5% of our profit to charity. Okay, so basically, businesses try to convince people that they do things that are good for the community. Or could be fair trade. Okay, could be fair trade for coffee, for example, where people, consumers, they feel good about buying a coffee that has the fair trade label because they feel like they contribute to making sure that the coffee growers, they have decent income. CER is the same thing, but for the environment. Okay, you have many companies that now pretend to be carbon neutral. Okay, and of course, in most cases, it is what we call a greenwashing. So they just pretend, or they just pretend they have zero impact on the environment, even though in practice it's not really the case. But if they say something like, every time we sell a car, we plant 10 trees. That's the typical example. We plant trees so we can compensate our CO2 emissions. Again, in most cases, it's simply greenwashing. Greenwashing means that you pretend you are green, but you are not really, okay? Right. So, of course, this is something that is meant to improve brand image and to make consumers feel good about buying your product because they feel like they do something good for the community or something that is good for the environment. I think if I remember well, and you guys, maybe you can tell me, I think this feeling we have when you do something good, I think we call that the warm glow feeling, right? The warm glow feeling, if I remember well. So, it's when you do something good, you feel good about yourself. So when you buy a fair trade coffee, you feel good about your consumption decision. When you when you buy a product from a company that say, yeah, we protect the environment, same thing, you feel proud of purchasing a product, even if it's more expensive. from a business that respects the environment. When you see someone in the street, if you see someone homeless in the street and you give some money to that person, you're happy because you help this person, and you also feel good about yourself because it means that I'm a good person, I've done something good for this person. So we also directly benefit from this act of generosity. You can double check. I don't have my VPN on, so I cannot really check right now, but I'm pretty sure this is what we call the warm glow feeling. Right. Okay. Could be. What did I forget? Could be warranty, customer service, of course. Like I think the example that I usually give to my students is I think it's the South Korean, the car brand Kia, right? I think Kia is famous for offering pretty long warranty. I think it's 7 years, right? 7-year warranty, which is more than the average car brand or car maker. So that's one way you can differentiate yourself and convince and gain market share by doing something else than lowering the price. Could be something as simple as opening hours. Okay, if you open earlier or later, you can also steal some business from your competitors who open later or close sooner. And I think that's it. Okay. Any questions or any feedback or remarks about non-price competition? Okay. It's important to, there are, I think in an essay, if there is an essay about competition, like about market structures, I think it's really important to talk about non-price competition, because we often think about price and say, okay, the price is going to be high, the price is going to be low. But if we are in oligopoly or monopolistic competition, it is really important to talk about these other form of competition. Okay, there are 2 more keywords that students must know, and they often confuse them, which are limit pricing and predatory pricing. And they often confuse them because the objective is the same, and the method is the same. The method is the same. The outcome is going to be the same, but the context is different. So the method is the same because both limit pricing and predatory pricing, it's a pricing strategy that consists in lowering the price. We charge a low price. And the objective ultimately is to decrease competition. But the reason for which competition will be decreased is different. In limit pricing, we decrease the price to discourage new firms from entering the market. For example, we are already in the market. So if we are in the market, we say that we are an incumbent firm. Okay, we are in the market, incumbent firm. And if we know that there is another firm that is considering entering the market, we know that, of course. What we might want to do is to charge a very low price to just discourage entry. Why can this be effective to discourage entry? Well, first, because it sends a signal to the firm who's considering entering the market. And the message is, oh yeah, you want to enter, you want to compete with me, all right? Well, look how low the price can be. So if you enter, you better be pretty competitive, because otherwise I will charge a lower price than you, and you will just go bankrupt. And the other message is that if the price is low in this market, it's not going to be very profitable. Okay, with a very low price, it might not be worth it to break down the barriers to entry. There might be a very high startup cost, so it might cost a lot of money for new firms to enter this market. And with a very low price, well, we cannot make a lot of profit. So basically, a low price may discourage some firms. Say, nah, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. If I enter this market, it's going to cost me a lot of money, and look, I'm not going to make a lot of profit in this market. And therefore, the firm who's inside, who's in the market, the incumbent firm, as soon as the potential entrant has given up, as soon as the potential entrant has decided not to enter, boom, it can increase the price again, of course. Predatory pricing, it's not about discouraging potential entrants from entering. It's about killing those who are already in the market competing with me, okay? That's what predators do, they kill, okay? So there might be a few of my competitors in the market, they are already there. So what I do, I charge a very low price until they go bankrupt or until they decide to give up, until they decide to leave, okay? So it's different. Limit pricing, it's about making sure new firms don't enter. Predatory pricing is just to make sure that existing firms, they exit, okay? They leave. And of course, once they have left, I can, if I'm still alive, of course, I can enjoy a stronger market power. All right. So that's the difference between limit pricing and predatory pricing. Is the price lower than the average cost? Could be, if we refer to perfect competition, could be in the short run, not in the long run, however, okay? Because in the short run, it is actually better to stay in business, you know, that than to shut down. So you could sustain a price below your average cost over a short period of time. But then, of course, it's not something that is sustainable in the long run. If you charge a price below your average cost, you will just your losses will just become bigger and bigger over time. And at some point, it's not going to be sustainable. But in the short run, yes, it is possible to charge a price below the average cost. Absolutely. Actually, in some countries, it's illegal. I don't know if you know that. In some countries, it's illegal to charge a price below the average cost because it is considered as an unfair competition practice. There was one famous example, and I think there are examples in different countries, actually, of some huge grocery stores that sold in France. You know, in France we love bread, right? We love bread, and there was a huge chain of grocery store. You know it actually because it exists in China. It's Carrefour. I think in Chinese it's Jialefu, right? Something like that. And what they did is that they sold bread at a very, very, very low price, and actually they lost money on bread. It was something like, I don't know, 40 cents or 50 cents, so much lower than their own cost of production. So why did they do that? That's because they wanted to attract consumers, and they actually placed the bread at the very back of the store. So consumers, they had to go through the entire store to finally access the bread. And then, of course, on their way, they just bought other things that were profitable for the grocery store. But this practice was then considered illegal because, yes, there is some laws, at least in France. I don't know if it's the case in other countries, but there are some laws that prevent businesses from charging prices below their average cost of production, because it's considered as an unfair form of competition. All right. Yes, okay. I hope you understand how different here. Limit pricing, predatory pricing, it's important to distinguish them. And finally, but maybe not as important, the concept of price war, which is when, okay, you have several firms and they engage in a very, very cutthroat price competition. So very strong price competition. And they repeatedly decrease the price because they just want to gain or defend the market shares. Okay, good. Right, time to talk about collusion, an important part of this topic on oligopoly and collusion. Let's say a few words about that, and once we are done with this, we'll simply have to talk about the kink demand curve model, and we'll be done. Okay, so two more things to do. So yeah, in oligopolies, because they are just a few firms, there is always a tension between, oh, should we really fight or should we cooperate? Should we compete very strongly, or should we really engage in a very tough competition, or should we cooperate? Because of course, if we cooperate, we can agree to charge high prices or something like that, so we can make more money together, right? So, and if we compete, yeah, it's actually pretty bad to compete, because that means, especially if we compete in price, because this means that we will have to charge very, very low prices, because we might have to invest a lot in, or to spend a lot on advertisements, to try to convince people to buy from us and not from other businesses. So basically, for businesses, competition is usually not great. Okay, a competition is good for consumers because lower prices, better quality, more innovation, better features, more diversity. Okay, that's great. But for businesses, it tends to be costly. So why not just cooperating and say, hey, let's talk, let's not fight, and together we can both benefit from that. So this type of cooperation within an oligopoly, we call that collusion. And it's of course an anti-competitive behavior, okay, that restricts competition, where you have firms that are supposed to compete, but they don't, so they agree to restrict competition. And again, why do they do that? Because they expect that they will be able to make more profit. So of course, it's likely to be pretty bad for consumers, okay, because you can expect prices to be higher, there might be less innovation, there might be lower quality, less information through advertising, things like that. There is one exception that you can mention, which is about innovation, because if firms who collude, who restrict competition, if they succeed and if they make more profit, then they might have a better ability to innovate, okay? They might have a stronger ability to invest in research and development, and ultimately, this may benefit consumers, okay? If you have like a better product or lower cost of production through process innovation, this might ultimately benefit consumers, okay? But generally speaking, collusion is often regarded as something that is not good for consumers. Okay. So, what if we have this, and this is why game theory can be useful. This is one example. And actually, I think in books, in textbooks, they don't really use game theory to illustrate collusion. So I think it's very useful. So here we have two firms, firm A, firm B. Each of them has only two strategies. H stands for high price, L stands for low price, okay? So basically, high price means we don't fight, we cooperate, and low price would mean, okay, we fight, we compete. And clearly, they both agree to cooperate. Then this leads to a situation where they can make a lot of profit together. Okay, this could be $1 million if you want, $4 million each. And if they both charge a low price, then this leads to a situation when they don't make a lot of profit, $2 million each. Okay? Baby's crying. However, of course, the problem is that, okay, we would agree that collectively, it's better if they say, all right, let's not fight. Let's just both charge a high price. So together we can make $8 million, okay, $4 million each. That's pretty good. And that's much better than if we both fight, if we both charge a low price and we would only make $2 million each. So we would say that this is the cooperative equilibrium, okay, high price, high price. And this would be the non-cooperative equilibrium, low price, low price. However, the problem that we have here is that this is not a Nash equilibrium, okay? If you circle the best responses, let's do it. Just hungry. The baby is just hungry. If we circle the best responses here, we would find something like that. All right. So that would be for firm A. That would be for firm B. We would have something like that. So we see that there will be the Nash equilibrium is actually the non-cooperative equilibrium where they would fight aggressively, where they would both charge a low price. All right, charging a high price is not an equilibrium, and if it's not an equilibrium, this means that each firm has an incentive to move. Okay, has an incentive to deviate from that cooperative equilibrium. So, for example, if we look at firm A clearly has an interest to move from high price to low price, because a high price, that firm only makes $4 million, and charging a lower price, it would get the entire market, okay, much greater market share, and therefore it could make much more money. And that's the same thing for firm 2. Firm 2 has an incentive to change from high price to low price because it could increase its profit from 4 to 6, say, $1 million. Okay, so again, this is just to show you that yes, of course, they have an incentive to cooperate, or yes, they would like to cooperate, but each of them has an incentive to cheat. Basically, each of them has an incentive to say something like, yeah, I'm gonna charge a high price. Yeah, don't worry, tomorrow, first time in the morning, I'm gonna keep a very high price for my product. You do the same. Yeah, okay, that sounds like a good plan. Okay, so they finish their meeting and they have agreed to charge a high price, but they both have an incentive to or not to respect the agreement, because they anticipate that if they cheat, if they said that they were going to charge a high price, but if in practice they charge a low price, they will make 6 rather than 4. So they will cheat and they will charge a low price. The problem, and this is a good illustration of the prisoner's dilemma, is that if they both do that, well, this leads to a situation this leads to the worst possible outcome for the two of them. Okay, so yes, there is a cooperative outcome that is great. There is a non-cooperative outcome that is terrible, and because each of them is selfish, they deviate from the cooperative equilibrium, and this leads to this very poor situation. So this is an illustration of the prisoner's dilemma applied to the case of an oligopoly. Okay, and this is exactly what I explained here. Okay, yes, okay, easy. There are two main types of collusion: formal collusion and tacit collusion. So formal collusion, it's when they formally agree. Okay, so there is a meeting, or at least a form of communication, of a direct form of communication, and they formally agree to limit competition and in order to increase profit. So yeah, and usually because they increase prices, the output that they sell tends to be lower. So low output and higher prices. And you know that in most countries, I'm not going to talk about the legal aspects of collusion, but you know that in most countries, collusion is illegal. Okay, it's not something that is allowed by competition authorities, and in each country, there is an authority that is usually called the competition authority, whose job is to screen different markets and try to uncover some businesses who have engaged in this form of collusion, and it's illegal. So that's why in most cases collusion is covered, which means it's hidden. Okay, they do that in secret. They don't want to get caught, because if they get caught, they will have to pay pretty significant fines. It could be billions of dollars. Or it could be overt, when it's just open for everyone to see. There is one example, which is the OPEC, okay, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is an example of firms who have, or actually not firms, but countries here who have engaged in formal collusion. We call that a cartel. A cartel is just a group of firms engaging in formal collusion. And this is an example of overt collusion. Okay, it's not. It's a cartel that is. Everybody knows that those countries are colluding to keep the price of oil at a certain level, and they also control the amount, the volume of oil that is going to be extracted within a given period of time. They meet every 6 months. So why is this overt? Because they are countries, so they won't be punished by anyone, basically, right? There is no authority that is going to tell them, hey, no, you can't do that. It's not good for consumers. The prices are very high. It's not good for the economy. All right. So that's pretty much the only known exception of a cartel that is open for everyone to see. It's not something that is hidden. But when private businesses, when private firms engage in formal collusion, then they try to do that without having anyone noticing, because it's illegal and they could be in trouble. Right, so that's a formal collusion. They explicitly agree to restrict competition. Tacit collusion. So first, you should really explain what the word tacit means, because most students in China, I guess, they have never really heard this word before. So I looked the definition in the dictionary, and tacit means understood without being stated. Okay, so you can give examples. Okay, try to give examples to illustrate these words so it makes a bit more sense to them. So what we call tacit collusion is a situation where businesses, they do not formally agree, they do not meet, they do not directly communicate, but they somehow, and I'm going to explain how, they somehow manage to restrict competition. And the idea here, to keep it simple, is that they do not directly communicate. Okay, there is no meeting, there is no phone call or something like that, but they usually use price signals to communicate. Okay, so for example, it can be something as simple as, hey, if I increase the price, if there are two firms in the market, I increase the price, then my competitor will interpret this as, oh, so okay, so my competitor keeps a high price. Maybe that means that my competitor does not want to fight with me. On the other hand, if I reduce the price, suddenly this basically signals that, hey, I want to fight. Okay, so cutting the price would send a signal meaning that I want to compete. Keeping a high price sends a message that say, all right, we don't have to fight. So this is how firms can communicate through price signals, through the market, basically, even if they don't directly meet, or even if they don't send each other emails or phone calls. And that's actually a problem for competition authorities, because then there is no proof, right? There is no proof that they collude, because they just communicate through price signals. That makes collusion very hard to prove in this case. So one way they can actually cooperate, one way they can coordinate their strategy is to use, as I said, price signals or price leadership. Often it's when you have one dominant firm, or one firm that is the leader in the market, that is going to set the price, or to change the price in the market, and the other firms, they are simply going to follow. Okay, so if you have the dominant firm that increases the price, then the other firms are also going to increase the price. Okay, so we call that a follow the leader informal agreement. And you see that this leads to a situation where basically everybody charges the same price. Okay, for example, a high price, and they don't even have to communicate in any formal way. Okay, they just look at the price charged by the other firms. Yes. Okay, or could be that they agree that they should not spend too much on advertising. Could be that they do not steal existing consumers from other businesses, that they do not engage in aggressive marketing strategies to steal businesses from other businesses. But for A2 students, they should really know price leadership. They should know that keyword. And they should understand what this concept is about. They should understand that price leadership is basically a mechanism that firms can use to communicate, or at least to agree to coordinate their strategy, especially their pricing strategy, to engage in tacit collusion within an oligopoly. That's basically the idea. Okay. Finally, last thing we got to do before we can have a look at the king to demand curve model is the problem of stability. Because and this is very clear in the game that we have there. Here we have some kind of collusion. Okay, if we somehow, I'm not going to give you the detail, but if somehow firms manage to sustain this cooperative equilibrium where they both charge a high price, you see the problem is that they both have an incentive to deviate. Okay, both firms have an incentive to deviate from that cooperative equilibrium, and if the incentives to deviate are stronger than the incentives to respect or to comply with the collusive agreement, then the collusion is not going to be stable. Okay, collusion is stable if the benefit of colluding is greater than the benefit of deviating from the collusive agreement. So that's what we mean by a collusion stability. Okay, and that's what I explained. When you have several firms who engage in collusion, each of them, especially those who are the most efficient, because they are the ones who would have the potential to compete the hardest, they have an incentive to break ranks, which means to deviate from the agreement, and to decrease the price or to sell more output, basically to try to gain market shares. Okay, they to compete. So yeah, each member has an incentive to defect, to deviate from the agreement, but something that can encourage them from not doing so and to respect the agreement and to keep colluding is because they might be afraid of retaliation. Okay, so basically something like, oh, okay, so you want to compete, you don't want to collude with us. Okay, let's fight, but everybody's going to lose, because that means that everybody is going to charge a very low price and we're not going to make a lot of profit. Okay, so the retaliation is basically well, the response that you should expect if you choose to deviate from a collusive agreement, if you try to steal market shares from the other businesses in the industries. Yeah, you might be successful in the short run, and yeah, it's true that in the short run you might make more profit, but then this means that everybody will compete in the future, in the long run, and everybody is going to be made worse off because of that, especially if everybody engages in a price war. All right, so that's why you have those two opposite forces. Okay, you have on the one hand the incentives to cooperate, the incentives to collude. On the other hand, you have incentives to deviate and to steal market shares from the other businesses. Okay, and the which force is going to be the stronger is going to determine whether the collusive agreement is stable or not. Okay, and there are some factors that make it more or less difficult to achieve collusion. Okay, so I've only focused on some. There are more of them, but I have only kept those that make the most sense and those which are the easiest to explain to your students. So yeah, collusion tends to be harder to achieve when there are many businesses. Okay, because basically, if you want collusion to be successful, you need to have everyone on board. Okay, because if you have some firms who refuse to collude, they will keep charging a lower price. They will get the entire market or most of it, and then your collusive agreement is not going to be very effective. So if there are only 2 or 3 firms, it's more likely that you can have like an agreement and to have everyone on board. If there are 15, 18 firms, it's going to be more complicated, of course, to make this work. Could be also harder when monitoring price and output levels is difficult. Why? Because collusion is basically agreeing on what price we charge or what output we sell. Okay, but if you want to make collusion successful, you need to be able to make sure that the other firms have actually respected the agreement. Okay, that if you agreed to set a price at $10 and to sell 20 units, you need to be able to check whether the other businesses have actually complied with the agreement, whether they have respected the agreement. So that's why you need to be able to monitor the price and output levels, okay, to tell whether the other players, they have played by the rules or not. But in some cases, monitoring price and output levels can be difficult, especially for businesses that sell dozens or hundreds of products. It can be very hard to monitor that, to have that information. And in this case, collusion is harder to form because basically, if you cheat, you may actually get away with it. You may charge a lower price, and then you may pretend that, no, I have not decreased my price, or no, I have not increased my output level. And if the other businesses, if they are unable to check, then they might just believe you. They might just say, okay, well then I guess you tell the truth, no problem. So you can benefit from cheating. You might benefit from deviating from the agreement. And if everybody does that, then of course collusion will not be stable. Again, it's more difficult to achieve collusion if there are low barriers to entry. It's quite easy to understand because, again, what is the objective of collusion is to make more profit. But of course, if the businesses within the market, if they make more profit, this will attract many new firms from outside the market. Yeah, because, hey, look at the profit that they make in this market. I want some of it. I want a piece of it. And if there are low barriers to entry, then you will have many new firms which are going to enter. And then, of course, as we said earlier, the more firms you have in the market, the more difficult it is to achieve and sustain collusion. On the other hand, if you have high barriers to entry, even if the firms within the industry, they make a lot of profit, nobody will be able to enter. Nobody will might be able to jeopardize the stability of the collusive agreement. It is also more difficult to achieve collusion when firms have different cost structures, especially when you have some firms which are very cost efficient and some firms who are very cost inefficient, okay? Simply because if you are more efficient than your competitor, why should you work with them? Basically, why should you cooperate with them? Doesn't make sense. You can just engage in predatory pricing, charge a very low prices, and you kill them. You kill them, then they are gone and you are a monopoly, okay? So yeah, why cooperating with firms that are less efficient than you? It's only when firms have similar cost structures that colluding makes sense, because if you instead, if you engaged in a price war, this would be very costly for everyone, okay? And the last thing that makes collusion more difficult is when there are some powerful buyers, okay? So buyers who have, for example, a large market share, but on the demand side, okay, not on the supply side. Because if you are a business and there is a very important buyer, okay, and you really want to make a deal with this buyer because there is a lot of money involved. So basically, this means that buyers, they have some market power. Buyers have some bargaining power. Then the buyer might actually use this power to put pressure on you, the seller, to say, okay, if you want to make a deal with me, if you want me to buy your product from you and not from one of your competitors, you better offer me a discount, okay? But maybe you can't because you agreed to keep a high price, okay? So maybe the collusion prevents you from charging a low price. But if you really want the business of that buyer, you might have to just deviate from the collusive agreement and offer a discount, offer a low price to this important buyer in order to get this buyer's business. Okay, but so you see that basically this is something that can exert some pressure on businesses who are engaged in collusion, and to encourage them or to give them more incentive to deviate from the agreement and charge lower prices so they can make a deal with some important buyer and important buyers who have a strong bargaining power in this market on the demand side. Okay, so I've only kept 5 factors. This is mostly for MCQs. Yeah, there are many MCQs where students are expected to explain, okay, collusion is more or less difficult when blah, blah, blah. But these are the major factors. Okay, I think this really covers every possible MCQ about that. All right, then there are two slides about collusion and law, but I have used the one step further star because this is not tested in A2. This is actually tested in AP, but this is not tested in A2. So I removed those slides, which takes us to the last part of this topic on oligopoly about the King's demand curve model. But before we start that, is there any question about collusion? What it is, what is the objective, formal collusion, tacit collusion, cartels, the stability of collusion, and the factors that can undermine the stability of collusion. Is there any question about that? Are we clear? Are we clear on that? All right, I'll take this as a yes. Okay, the King's demand curve model is not something that is very complicated, but for some reason, students, they always hate it. But it's actually quite simple to explain it. And this is how I explain it. So, and usually it works well. So let's say that what did you share, Caitlin? Let me download the file that you shared. What is it? Could you please explain the diagram? Okay, it's downloading. Oh, wow. Okay, let me share my screen. That's what you sent me. It's a bit complicated, but give me a second so I can analyze it. What is that? Demand, marginal cost, so it's the industry. Okay, give me a minute. I'm trying to analyze that, but that it would be good to have some explanations with it. So industry, marginal cost, demand, marginal revenue. What? Marginal revenue for the industry? Why would we have something like that for the industry? No, the left-hand side diagram doesn't make sense because the marginal revenue is something for one firm. It's not something for the industry. So I don't see, I see how you can have a demand in the industry, okay? But I don't see how you could have a marginal revenue for the industry. It doesn't make much sense to me. That's the first impression I have. Ideal cartel, okay, so it's like monopoly pricing. Okay, so basically QM is like a monopoly. This would be if all firms could essentially merge or like behave like a monopoly, they would maximize that. Competitive, okay, competition would be something like that, assuming that, okay, so you're comparing a competitive equilibrium with a monopoly. Okay, so that's cartel deadweight loss, yes. Okay, so okay, I understand. So we have on the left-hand side diagram, we basically compare competitive equilibrium with a monopoly equilibrium, and we say, all right, it's complicated. It doesn't work well, honestly. It doesn't work well because a cartel is not like it's not exactly like a monopoly because they are still different businesses, and they might have different cost structures. So here you would basically assume that all firms, they have the exact same cost structure and they merge, so they effectively become a monopoly. Ideal cartel. Okay, and the right-hand side, so it doesn't make much sense to me, honestly, because this would suggest that they are price taker. Look at that. So this means we are in an oligopoly, but they are price taker. But no, they are not price taker. So this would be It's too complicated. You do not use this with your students, please. So I think this would work well for very strong competition where all businesses sell exactly the same product if they compete in price, so they are not price taker, but it's true that they would face a demand that would be perfectly elastic if they compete, so this would make some sense. Then you have the best possible deviation. And there is too much information on this diagram. There is way too much information. And why would we have, I don't really understand, however, why the demand would be perfectly price elastic at PM, because the demand would certainly not be zero. It's too complicated. There is too much information, and it would require step-by-step explanation. Actually, yeah, you can calculate the best possible deviation, but using a diagram is clearly not the most straightforward way. And if you want to calculate the best possible deviation, yeah, it's easier to use examples with some figures where you give some information about the demand at different prices. You can give the demand schedule, for example, and you just analyze, okay, if I wanted to deviate from the agreement, what price should I charge? And if you have enough information about demand, then you can actually get the answer. But this diagram, this side-by-side diagram, is really too complicated. And I would need more time to analyze it. And can you tell me where you found it so I can read the explanations just to find that somehow it can make sense? But it seems to me like they wanted to just make things simple by saying, okay, a cartel is like a monopoly, and not colluding is like competition. But to me, it's a very narrow. It doesn't always work like this. Okay, so my advice would be, please remove that from your PPT. Remove that from your PPT because it is complex. I really doubt many of your students will be able to truly understand how it works unless you spend 2 lessons to explain it. It may make some sense in some special circumstances. It's very narrow, that's for sure. So yeah, please. I'm not saying that this diagram is wrong. Maybe it's actually correct, but if it is correct, it is under very special circumstances and under very special assumptions. And it's still, to me, there is still too much information, so that makes it very hard to understand. So I would definitely not use this diagram. And imagine the time that your students would need to do that during an exam. So yeah, I would not use that as a way of explaining collusion. All right, so where's my clip? Okay. So the kinked demand curve model, this is how I explain it. I start by saying, okay, let's say that we look at prices in the market, and we see that prices, they don't change very often, okay? Over the last 2 years or 6 months of prices, they have remained pretty much the same. And I try to understand why. One obvious reason would be to say, yeah, that's because firms collude. Firms have agreed on a certain price, and they just maintain the price that they have agreed on. Okay, and it's a valid explanation. It's possible that, yes, this is because prices don't change. This is why, because prices are stable, even if there are some changes in, for example, the price of electricity, even if the cost of production changes slightly, firms do not change the price because they have agreed not to, they have agreed on a certain price. Okay, but there is another possibility. which is simply to say firms don't change the price because they feel like it is in their best interest not to do so. They feel like increasing the price would be bad for them, and decreasing the price would be also bad for them, even if they are not engaged in collusion, and even if they do not cooperate with any other businesses in the industry. They just choose to keep the price unchanged because they believe that changing the price would lead to less profit. Okay, that's basically what the King's demand curve model aims at explaining, that firms don't change the price, so we can observe some price stability within an oligopoly, even if firms are not engaged in collusion, simply because they are afraid of increasing or decreasing the price. That's it. That's what the King demand curve model is about. So it is a model that attempts to provide a non-cooperative explanation for the observed price stability in some oligopolistic market. Okay, because in some market, empirical evidence has suggested that yes, prices may be a bit more stable in an oligopoly than in other market structures. Okay, and again, why do we have that price stability? According to this model, that's because firms, they believe, it's all about what they believe. They believe that they should not change the price. Okay, so there is a pre-established equilibrium, a certain price and a certain quantity, and they believe that it doesn't matter what they do, increase or decrease the price, it's going to be bad for them. Okay, and what is very interesting about this model is that they have they have expectations about what their competitors would do if they change their price. Okay, so for example, I say, hey, if I increase the price of my product, what will my competitors do? Will they also increase their price, or will they keep the same price as before? Okay, and same thing, hey, if I choose to reduce the price of my product, what will my competitors do? Will they also decrease their price, or will they keep the same price as before? And in this model, it is assumed that oligopolists, they expect their rivals to react differently depending on the direction of the price change, which means that I believe that the competitors would have different responses to the price change depending on whether I increase or decrease the price. Okay. And to simplify this King's demand curve model, because it has a very complicated name, usually to simplify it and just to joke about it with my students, I call it the pessimistic firm model because firms, they are very pessimistic about what's going to happen if they change the price. I mean that they always expect that the worst possible thing will happen, that their competitors will respond in the worst possible way for them, for the firm who changes the price. So that's why I call that the pessimistic firm model. So, for example, if I increase the price in this model, I believe that my competitors will maintain their initial prices. And why is this the worst possible thing for me? Because if I am the only one who increases the price, then I am going to lose many customers. Okay, everybody else still has a low price. I am the only one with a high price, so I will lose many consumers. What does it mean in terms of the demand curve? If I increase the price, I expect to lose many consumers. So I expect that my individual demand curve is very elastic above the initial equilibrium price. Okay, so if I charge a price above the initial equilibrium price, the demand is elastic because I will lose many customers. So, and that's why it's going to be bad for me to increase the price. Okay, because if I increase the price, I lose many customers and I make less profit, basically. However, if I decrease my price, then I believe it's not, I don't know if it's going to happen. Okay, it's just what I believe. Maybe I'm wrong. It's just what I expect. I expect that my competitors will do the same thing. Okay. So in this case, why is this a bad news for me? Because if we all decrease the price, I'm not going to attract many consumers. Okay, I'm not going to increase my market share. If we all decrease the price by 10%, well, I'm not going to get more market share. I'm not going to attract many new consumers, and therefore this means that I expect the demand curve that I face to be rather price inelastic below the initial equilibrium price. Okay, so I cut the price, but the quantity demanded to me will not increase very much. And that's why we call that the kinked demand curve model, because we expect demand to be elastic, so relatively flat above the initial price, relatively inelastic, so relatively steep below the equilibrium price. So there will be a change in slope, a sudden change in slope. Okay, it will go from being rather flat to being rather steep. Caitlin says, so it has two variables in this model. One is my price, the other is my rival's price. It might actually, we don't know how many firms there are, okay? It's not, I don't know if you can regard the prices charged by the other businesses as another variable. You could, I guess you could say that, and it's not necessarily only two firms. If you want to keep it simple, and you're right that it's always a good thing to keep things as simple as possible, you could consider that there are only two firms, yes, and your expectations would simply be about the response of the second firm, okay? But this could be that there are more rivals, that there are more firms to respond to your price change, okay? But you can see it this way, Caitlin. Yes, you could say that there are two variables, so there are two strategies, for example, two strategies for each firm for any price change, okay? If I decrease the price, the other firm can either follow or not follow, okay? In my case, I can increase the price or decrease the price. Actually, you could see it like that. Okay, let's try to do something interesting, something that I have never tried to do before. You just give me an idea, Caitlin. Let's use this. I have not finished my definition. You should see that. Let's try to put it into, I have no idea where I'm going, okay? Okay, so basically you could choose, this is one player, one firm could choose, I need one more. So you would have here player one, so that's you. This is gonna work. I need one more. We would have player two, could work. Maybe we can actually represent the kink demand curve model with a payoff matrix, who knows? So here you can, so player two, you can, don't change the price, you can increase the price or you can decrease the price, and the other player can follow or not follow, be something like that. That's essentially what we would be talking about, right? Something like that. Follow or not follow. So of course, if you do not change the price, then it's irrelevant. Okay, so in this case, irrelevant, no change. So you, or basically, actually, can we put it differently? Yeah, well, we could actually even do the same thing. I'm trying to think at the same time to see how we could represent that. We could almost do something like that. Increase, change, decrease. Okay, so basically, if you don't change, well, it's likely that the other firm isn't going to change anything. And the idea is that you feel like if you increase the price, the other firm is not going to change anything, so it will be here. If you decrease the price, you feel like the other firms are going to decrease the price, something like that. So that's what you expect. That's what you expect. No, I don't know. I was trying to find a smart way to to represent this as a payoff matrix, but okay. If other firms do that, so if I increase the price, I expect that the other firm don't change the price, would be here. And if player two decreases the price, okay, so we would have something like that essentially, but I don't think it really helps to represent that as a payoff matrix. I tried, but sorry, it's not very successful. Let's just leave this aside, okay? But yeah, essentially, you have one firm who can choose. Let me share my PPT again. You have one firm that considers, hey, should I change the price? Should I increase the price? Should I decrease the price? And they form expectations about what's going to be the response of the other businesses. And yes, they always anticipate what's worse. What's the worst. So if I increase the price, I will lose many customers because the other businesses will keep the same price as before. And if I decrease the price, that's also terrible for me because I wanted to gain consumers by doing so, but that's not going to happen because everybody is also going to cut their own price. All right. So that's the idea. Yeah. If I have more time, I'll also try to represent it as a payoff matrix, and who knows, we can actually come up with something interesting. All right, and that's why to keep it, that's why the demand is going to look like that. You guys see it? Yeah, you see it. It's going to look like that because we start from I'll go back to this. We start from P star. That's the initial price, and above P star, I expect to lose many customers if I raise the price. So the demand is elastic, and below P star, I don't expect to gain many customers, so the demand will be more inelastic. So you see that there is a sudden change in slope at this initial equilibrium point. That's what we call the kink. So that's why we say the demand curve is kinked. And this sudden change in slope creates what we call a jump discontinuity in our MR curve, okay? Because it's essentially like if we had two demand curves, one that would be, let's try to use the same color, and perhaps, okay. It's like if we had this first demand curve that is pretty flat, okay, with this initial MR curve. So this would be the elastic demand. You can put it this way, the elastic demand. Okay, and we would have an inelastic demand. So I can actually continue it. Okay, an inelastic demand and the associated MR curve. So it's if I'm not too wrong, okay. So it's not too bad. See, it should cut there. So it's like if I have a combination of two demand curves, I will be on the elastic demand curve above P star, and I will be on the inelastic demand below P star, and therefore above Q star. Okay, and therefore this creates this discontinuity in MR. And this is actually why, but I do not want to give too much details, especially because the students, they don't need to know exactly what's going to happen with MR. It's actually enough if students, they are able to explain why this demand curve looks like that. Okay, it's enough to understand that, okay, it's going to be elastic above P star, it's going to be inelastic below P star, and why, to explain that this is about the expectations and that firms expect different things to happen depending on whether they increase or decrease the price. Then the shape of the MR curve, I really don't think that students are expected to be able to graph it properly and to explain why we have this jump discontinuity, especially in essay question. What really matters is the shape of the demand curve. But if you want to take it one step further, you can say that, yes, this is going to create a jump discontinuity. And this is how you can actually explain that firms don't have an incentive to change the price. I'm going to just show it to you right now, and then I will go back to the explanation. Because if P star and Q star is the equilibrium, okay, if we consider that this is an initial equilibrium, it actually means that MC, okay, so the explanation here gets a bit tricky. So usually I don't explain that to my students, okay? But if you want to take your lesson one step further, this is what you can tell them. If Q star is to be an equilibrium, an initial equilibrium, this means that MC must go through the discontinuity, okay? Because if MC was going, let's say, I don't know, somewhere here, then this quantity would be optimal, okay? And if MC was going there, then this quantity would be optimal, okay? MC is equal to MR to maximize profit. So if you want Q star to be an equilibrium, it essentially means that MC is equal to MR at this level of output, okay? So it is, the MC must go through this jump discontinuity, okay? Okay. So then what happens if we increase the price? If we increase the price, basically we're going to sell less output, okay? We're going to move, let me show you. If we increase the price, we're going to sell less output. So we are going to move in this direction, okay, to the left of Q star. But in that case, our profit would decrease because you see that for any level of output that is less than Q star, MR is greater than MC, which means that if you produce less, you will save the marginal cost. Let me just identify it. Okay, if you produce, let's just say you produce one less unit, okay, just one less unit. So this is what you're going to save, okay, the marginal cost, because you produce one less unit. So you save the cost of producing the last unit. And this is what you lose, okay, because of course, if you do not produce the last unit, you do not sell the last unit, and therefore you lose the marginal cost. So this again is what you lose if you increase the price to sell the last unit, and this is what you gain if you choose to raise the price to sell one last unit. Okay, and clearly what you save, is less than what you lose. So what you gain is less than what you lose, which means that if you choose to increase the price to sell one less unit, your profit will decrease. So you should not raise the price. Okay, so maybe you should decrease the price. So what if you decrease the price? So you sell one more unit. Okay, so in that case, you will move to the right of Q star. Okay, so if you sell one more unit, of course, you have to pay the marginal cost because you have to produce one more unit, and the cost of producing one more unit is the marginal cost. So this is the cost of producing one more unit. That's the bad news. But the benefit is that if you produce one more unit, you can sell one more unit, and therefore you can increase your total revenue. Okay, but now we are to the right of Q star, so the change in total revenue is given by MR2. Okay, so this would be the amount by which your total revenue would increase if you sold one more unit. Okay, so it costs you this to produce one more unit, and you only gain this from the sale of one more unit. So what you gain is less than the cost of producing it. So again, producing one more unit, decreasing the price to produce one more unit is not profitable. Your profit will actually decrease. So you see, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you increase the price or if you decrease the price. You believe, because again, it might not be the real demand curve that you are facing, but this is the demand curve that you think you are facing, which means that you think that if you increase the price or if you decrease the price, your profit will decrease. And this is exactly what I explained here, okay? Those two slides explain what I just said, okay? What happens if I increase the price? What happens if I decrease the price? I believe that in both cases, my profit would decrease, okay? So what is the best thing for me to do? Well, I keep the same price as before. I do not change the price. And therefore, this is why we will observe price stability in this market, even though firms are not engaged in collusion. They don't change the price simply because they are afraid of the consequences of changes the price. They are convinced that this will lead to less profit for them. Okay, and this is what the king to demand curve model is about. Okay, so yeah, okay, the monopolist expects that there will be a change in slope. Okay, the consequence is that there will be a jump discontinuity of the marginal cost. Okay, that's what I explained. If we want the initial quantity and price to be in equilibrium, then MC must go through this jump discontinuity, but this is a bit more advanced. And as a result, and this is what I just explained with the diagram, the oligopolist believes that it is not optimal to increase the price and it is not optimal to decrease the price. So they will choose not to change anything. we will observe price stability, even if firms are not engaged in any form of collusion. And what's quite funny about this model is that because they will not change the price, they will never know whether they were right or wrong. Okay, they will never be able to find out whether their expectations were actually correct or not. Okay, the only way they could find out would actually change the price. That's yay. So what happens? But because they don't change it, because they feel like it's not profitable to change it, they will never know if they were right. So the conclusion is that this model, the kinked demand curve model, basically tells us that price stability is driven by the fear of rivals' potential reaction to changes in prices. That's it. That's what the kinked demand curve model is about. Okay, then there is something about price stickiness, but I think it's a bit too more advanced. So I'm gonna skip this part. You can have a look at it, but this is usually not something that I teach to my students. The idea here is that, to simplify about price stickiness, is that even if the marginal cost changes slightly, you see from MC1 to MC2, from MC1 to MC3, as long as it still goes through the jump discontinuity, Q star, P star remains optimal, and firms still believe that it's not worth it, it's not profitable to change the price. So even if there are some changes in their cost of production, they will still charge the same price, even if it's more costly to produce, even if it's less costly to produce, they will still charge the same price. And this is something that we call price stickiness. Even when the cost of production changes, firms charge the same price stickiness. And we see that this is going to be the case as long as MC remains within that jump discontinuity, for the reason that I just explained here. Okay, as long as this is true, this reasoning there is valid. So price stickiness. Okay, exactly, the resistance of price to change. Okay, and finally, there are some limitations, and this is the last slide. In practice, it's not very much supported by empirical evidence. Yeah. Do we really have prices being more stable in oligopolistic market? There is no great empirical evidence that this is the case, or at least no more than in other market structures. It doesn't really explain how did we get here, right? Because we start from this initial equilibrium, we start from this pre-established equilibrium price and quantity, but there is no explanation whatsoever about how did we get there. How can we explain this pre-established equilibrium? Perhaps price stability is not the consequence of firms being aware of this kinked demand curve, but might simply have to do with some commercial practices that it's just too costly. There might be some menu costs, something as simple as that. It is too costly to calculate new prices, to calculate and to change the price on a regular basis in this market. So perhaps there are other reasons that have more to do with commercial practices than businesses forming expectations about the potential response of their rivals if they change the price. Okay, so what I mean here is that, yes, this model is one possible explanation among many other explanations. So if you observe price stability within the market, you cannot conclude that, yes, this is because firms are afraid that changing the price would lead to a decrease in profit. This is not the only possible explanation. Okay, and that's it. Yeah, that's the kinked demand curve model. Questions? Questions about the kinked demand curve model? Does it make sense? So yeah, bottom line, firms don't change the price because they are afraid of the consequences. They believe we don't know for a fact if it's going to be true or not, but they believe that that's going to be bad for them because I increase the price. I am the only one to do so, so I lose a lot of consumers. That's not good for me. I decrease the price, hoping to gain market shares, but everybody's going to follow the decrease in price. So my objective is not going to be successful. I will only end up with a lower price and not a larger market share. So it's also bad for me. So I keep the same price as before, price stability, even if I am not engaged in any form of collusion. That's it. That's how students can in just a few sentences. You see 3-4 sentences plus a diagram. This is how you can explain the king to demand curve model. And if you want to take it one step further, yes, you can explain price stickiness by saying that as long as the marginal cost changes, but as long as it stays within this jump discontinuity, charging P star remains optimal. So even though costs of production either increase or decrease, the optimal price remains the same, price stickiness. Okay. So regarding the material, you already have the PPT, which I have updated. Okay, the PPT has been updated since last year. I have removed some things. I have mostly simplified. Okay, I've mostly simplified some slides, some keywords. It's mostly the same, but yeah, it's easier compared with last year. I have also added the concept cards. This I've done. You can see that the concept cards, they are here about oligopoly. So we have 2 drawing challenges, a clown and a zombie. And I'm still working on the definition. So the definitions will be there soon. And the summary will also be there soon. Now I have more time to focus on those workshops. So I will use that time to add some material for this workshop, but also for some other previous workshops, because there is still some more content and material that I want to upload. So please have a look at the documents that are supporting the previous workshops you attended, because some more new content is going to be added in the coming days and weeks. All right, so if there are no more questions, I wish everyone a great evening. And next week, we'll talk about monopolistic competition, and we'll talk about contestable market theory. This will be the end of this second unit, the price system and the microeconomy, and we'll be ready to talk about chapter 3, government microeconomic intervention. We'll talk about market failures. We'll talk about income inequality and the labor market. Good evening, guys, and see you next time. Bye-bye.